everyone, and welcome to today's podcast. We are joined by Michael Lotito. He's the co-chair of Littler's Workplace Policy Institute. So welcome, Michael. It's good to have you.
Nice to be with you, David, and all your listeners. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So we're going to talk about the kind of the fallout from the 2020 election today in terms of how it impacts employers and the kind of broader labor market. So there's a lot to unpack here. Obviously, as at this time, it looks like it's going to be President-elect Biden. So there's some ambitious hopes for changing the workplace landscape from that side of the aisle. So let's first set the table on the reality here is, as of right now, it seems like the Republicans will maintain control of the Senate, something that would severely limit Biden's ability to create any sort of lasting change or major policy changes. So there are two open Senate races. If the Democrats win them both, that does change things. But if they don't, I'm kind of wondering, what does Biden's action plan look like? We've seen a lot of executive orders in the past from the last two presidents. So do we see him turn to that as a tool to get some of those changes made?
I think that you're touching on a number of really excellent points. There's a legislative agenda. There's an executive order agenda. There's a regulatory agenda. And then there's all of the other priorities, some of which, like dealing with the virus, we know about. But one of the things we know about the presidency is there's always something unexpected that happens. George Bush, the terrorist attack, the horror, the pandemic in this situation, there's always something else that's going to happen. So let me see if I can unpack it. With respect to the legislative situation, you're correct. The control of the Senate is really going to be determined in Georgia as to whether or not it's going to be 50-50, assuming Tillis and Sullivan hold on, which I think they will, making it, so let's assume right now 50-48. So the Democrats need both of those seats. And then Vice President-elect Harris can break the tie. That suggests that the regulatory agenda, that the legislative agenda is alive, such as the ProAct and some other things that I think you're going to get into when we start chatting a little bit further about some of these issues. But I do think that the fact that the Democrats lost at least, I believe, 7 House seats, and that you will have such a close Senate, however it turns out, suggests to me that there may be a little bit more moderation that may come about, including the fact that President-elect Biden and Leader McConnell, have a very long history of working together, and both of them pride themselves on being able to make a deal. So it may be a situation where there's more emphasis in the early days about who the cabinet secretaries are going to be, who's the labor secretary, who are the sub-cabinet people, how quickly are they going to be confirmed. That too is dependent upon Georgia. If you have a Democratic-controlled Senate, the nominees are going to go through a lot faster than if you have a Republican one. So I think those kinds of things are going to take place, and we'll see how they play out. The executive order is something that the president can utilize right away. And there's both the reversals of previous executive orders, which can just take place with a stroke of a pen, as well as the issuance of new ones. And I would expect that then President Biden would issue an executive order that negates the recent affirmative action training diversity component for government contractors that has created a good deal of controversy, and negate that, and perhaps issue one that again encourages what I'll refer to as a robust diversity training, as to perhaps one that maybe is not quite so robust, if that's even the correct way of describing them. And then the other thing that I think that he would do is President Trump issued a tremendous number of executive orders dealing with immigration. And I think that President Biden would eliminate many of them and possibly substitute them with other executive orders that might be more, what's the word, inclusive, welcoming, fewer restrictions. I'm not exactly sure what the correct terminology is, but I would think something like that would happen. And then longer term, which I think we'll get into further in our discussions, is what happens on the regulatory side. And so you can only do so much with executive orders, and the executive orders, they come and they go depending upon who the president is. And any president would like his or her policies, have a lasting impact. So that gives you regulations, which is the second most certain way of creating change, after legislation. And so I think there'll be a robust regulatory agenda, regardless, obviously, of what happens in Georgia.
Yeah, it's interesting there. You going back to that Senate piece, I think the assumption is from a lot of people that, McConnell will just sort of block anything that Biden tries to do. But it sounds like from what you said there that, that may not be the case. Maybe there's more potential for things getting done than people think.
Well, I think there may be, maybe it's not so much on labor policy, but if Senator McConnell and Speaker Pelosi are unsuccessful during the lame duck of coming up with another COVID package, and assuming they do, and assuming then President Trump signs it, those are pretty big assumptions. But, if they do, great. If they don't, there's going to be a great deal of urgency in dealing with some of those issues. I mean, under the CARES Act, the expanded unemployment ends on December 31st. Some are projecting that as many as 13.5 million individuals could go on the unemployment ranks. There's also issues with respect to the sick leave provisions of the CARES Act. And so there'd be a tremendous amount of pressure to continue them. We've had over 100,000 cases a day, or just about 100,000 cases a day, I think, in the last week. So, as I said in another context, the virus is totally, completely non-discriminatory. They don't care who the president is, and the virus doesn't care what happens in Georgia. The virus doesn't care about any of this. The virus just wants to infect and kill us. And so when you look at it in those terms, I think that there's got to be some kind of a legislative solution that's going to address these concerns. And I think that calls for compromise. Will that lead to an emergency standard for OSHA? What's going to happen with Senator McConnell's desire for liability shields? There's an awful lot that can happen here. If President Biden, wants to have tax reform, there's going to have to be, negotiation. There's going to have to be resolution. What happens with climate? I mean, I don't think, Leader McConnell is just going to say no. The country clearly wants things to happen. And in 2022, both the D's and the R's have 4 somewhat at-risk senators that will be up for re-election, among a whole bunch of others that are probably pretty safe. And also, Mrs. Pelosi has to be thinking about, historically, the party in the majority loses seats in the midterm elections. And since her majority is already smaller than it otherwise would have been, she has to be conscious of that. So I think that there are some more global concerns that are going on that might drive resolution as opposed to just saying no.
Interesting. So, a Biden presidency, it was supposed to be very pro-labor administration. And that's sort of what they laid out from the campaign. So if they find themselves looking at executive action as sort of the primary way to get things done for at least the next 2 years, what are the most significant changes you think that they would target? Like you mentioned immigration there, but are there some other things that would be sort of immediate targets for them?
I think that government contractors, in particular, have to be concerned about, what kind of executive orders may come out that impose further restrictions on who's going to be eligible to get some of those government contracts, whether it be, for example, with an infrastructure bill or just the normal government contracts, defense and the like. And I think, a president can do a lot there. Kind of reminds me of the the blacklisting rule that was ultimately negated during the Obama administration. But do you have any unfair labor practice charges outstanding? What kind of position do you take with respect to union organizing? Is there going to be a neutrality provision? Is there going to be a card check provision? So we may see those kinds of provisions coming about through executive order. I'm sorry, it's been a long day of talking already.
No worries.
Those kinds of provisions in an executive order, including, more revelations on pay disparity and the like.
So, last year the House passed the ProAct, and it's something that Biden has largely supported. Of course, it got killed in the Senate. But so let's say for a moment that the Democrats pull off this big win and they get those two runoff elections, and Vice President Harris becomes the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. If we see this happen, there's talk of redefining what constitutes a gig worker. So expanding the ability to join a union, stuff like that. What in your mind are some of the key considerations for the ProAct? Key considerations the ProAct would have for employers down the line.
The ProAct, from organized labor standpoint, is like putting together 100 Christmas trees and then putting on the bottom gifts that cover that entire area and saying, Merry Christmas, organized labor. There's at least 50 different provisions of the ProAct that would change our fundamental labor law, the National Labor Relations Act passed in 1935, as you know. This is a huge deal. More specifically to your question, both President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris were in favor of California's Assembly Bill 5, or AB 5, as it's come to be known, and encouraged people in California to vote against Proposition 22, which of course passed last week by a 58-41 number. There's some slight differences in those numbers based upon the final votes, but it's pretty overwhelming victory. And at least for the transportation network companies and the delivery network companies, the TNCs and the DNCs, effective on or about December 14, 15, when the proposition goes into effect, there's really a third way classification. An individual is still an independent contractor, but they get some benefits, such as an increase over minimum wage and, some subsidies that they can utilize for healthcare and a variety of other things. And I think that the ProAct adopts the ABC test that was rejected by the California voters. California voters gave a verdict that they would prefer choice with respect to how you work as opposed to a mandate as to how you work. I think that's going to put a great deal of pressure on both the new president and the new vice president, whose positions were rejected by the purple state of California, 58-41, to include the ABC test in the ProAct. But clearly, that's one of the most important things about the ProAct that organized labor wants. Because if you convert the independent contractors to employees, then they can be organized under the National Labor Relations Act. And if you add to that the variety of other provisions that make it very difficult for employers to preserve union-free status under the terms of the ProAct, that opens up a huge potential seam of workers, not only today, but when you look at the way the economy and the workforce and workforce transformation is occurring, more and more people are saying, I want to have a choice in the way I work. I want to have a say in the way my relationships with the company is being defined. And, many of us may want to continue with a more traditional employee relationship because we've had really good BOSSs, and we like them. But, what if you've worked for several double SOBs backwards? Maybe you want to go into that kind of relationship again. Maybe you'd prefer, to be the captain of your own ship, so to speak. So I think there's going to be an enormous battle with respect to ABC and the ProAct. And the fact that you do have both on the Republican side and the Senate side, individuals up for re-election in both the House and the Senate in 2 years will make this an important issue because this year, as you've correctly stated, the ProAct was passed by the House. But that was a free vote. Because, they went to the representatives and said, it's okay, you can vote for this now because the Senate won't even take it up. And it's just one of these things, it's something you got to do. Don't even think about the policy because it's really not going to bind you. So I voted for it. This year, or next year rather, hey, you want to vote for this thing? No, I don't want to have anything to do with this thing. I'm going to get killed by it. Well, we'll primary you with somebody from the left, or we'll primary you from somebody from the right. And before, when it was a non-vote vote, this is a vote. Yeah. And then it puts the individual in a very uncomfortable position and say, I voted for this thing before. How do I vote against it this time? So it creates some very, very, very interesting dynamics. But if you want to bring the employer community together in opposition to a particular proposal, go forth with the ProAct. That will do it. The ProAct is EFCA on steroids. And it's not just the fact that it's easier to organize, employers don't have a voice in the process under the ProAct, but it's the negotiation of that agreement that if the parties don't come together, then the agreement gets imposed by an arbitrator. And that means that the employer loses control fundamentally of the terms and conditions of employment that are being offered. And a hallmark of the National Labor Relations Act is no party is required to agree to proposal or make a concession just because the other party wants you to. You bargain in good faith. Once you start with mandatory arbitration where you impose those terms, then employers become very, very concerned.
Yeah, you mentioned, this corporate pushback, I think is going to be significant there. And, what are some of the policies you think are probably going to, aside from the ProAct, he's talked about making it easier for people to join unions. There's a lot of different things. Minimum wage is on the table. So what do you think is going to spark the most resistance and where does it cost Biden the most? Because this is going to expend a significant amount of political capital. So what does he kind of have to give to get?
Well, the pro is numero uno because the ProAct, as I said, is the Christmas tree. And so all of those things about making it easy to organize, recognition based upon cards, a little bit different in the ProAct than it was in EFCA, but all of those things are in there. And, you've got our election report and, feel free to make that available to your listeners. We go through in some detail many of the different provisions, not all of them. That really takes a separate 30-page report to just detail how the ProAct impacts things. But I think that's going to be the big one. When you start talking about increasing pay, there's a certain segment of individuals that are very worried about that, especially those that have been dramatically impacted by the pandemic. I'm thinking about restaurants, I'm thinking about hospitality. And you have, these very, very high unemployment rates. I was pleased to see that the unemployment number came down the other day to 6.9. But in reality, the unemployment rate is much higher. When you start thinking about labor market participation rates, when you start thinking about the number of individuals that have taken themselves out of the workplace, when you think about the individuals that are part-time as opposed to full-time, when you think about individuals that maybe have a job, but it's not the same job that they had an expectation of getting, when you start thinking about what happens if we don't do airline relief. I mean, you're talking about tens of thousands of individuals on some sort of a furlough status that will go permanent. So in that kind of an environment, when you're trying to get out of this horrible pandemic situation, which, Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve, and others, much smarter than me, will say it'll certainly take through 2021, certainly in 2022, is that the time to start increasing minimum wage? Is that the time to start imposing sick leave requirements? Is that the time to start dealing with predictive scheduling legislation? All of those kinds of things have been talked about. Vice President Harris has even, supported some legislation on the predictive scheduling. And we've seen, that that's happened, obviously, at the state. But once you start putting it at the federal level, that becomes a very big deal. There's also the issue of time. There's only so many things any one person can do. And I go back, and I think it's very analogous. In the first 2 years of President Obama's administration, he made a decision, and there's a great article about it that the former president actually wrote that's in last week's New Yorker, which is worth a read, that he made a conscious decision against some of his high-level advisors that they were going to go for broke and get what has become to be known as Obamacare, which, of course, will be argued before the Supreme Court on November 10th. That took all of the oxygen out of the room. There was no more time for doing EFCA and other things. And the argument was, we'll take care of that in the next 2 years. Well, a funny thing happened on the way to the theater. They lost the House. So, things have a way of changing. And, I've been doing this for a long time, and it's very easy for folks to pontificate, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. I'm older. I'm never quite sure what's going to happen. And I really welcome people to the world of uncertainty. And I think that's a big problem. I think it's the reality, but it's also a big problem. Businesses, human beings generally thrive when there's predictability, structure, and certainty. You can plan your behavior appropriately, and you know what the rules are. We do not like uncertainty. And we're at the polar opposite of what organizations and human beings prefer. And that is uncertainty. New administration, we don't know who controls the Senate. Is the country going to come together? I mean, President Trump got, 71 million votes. How do we have a come by our moment to bring us together, which I sure hope that we do, going back to the Abraham Lincoln, the House divided, cannot stand. This is a very, very serious problem. One of the most serious in the history of the United States. I mean, in World War II, we were threatened, but we came together. When the Twin Towers went down, we were threatened, but we came together. Now we have this pandemic that one could argue is more lethal than any kind of a war that we've been in, and we still can't seem to come together. So coming together is going to take a great deal of sensitivity and a great deal of compromise. And if somebody says it's going to be my way or the highway, I don't care, progressive or extremist on the other side, that's going to be a problem. And I think that President Biden and Leader McConnell understand that.
Yeah. And, you mentioned there, tomorrow, I think it is it, right? The ACA sits before the Supreme Court. Wednesday. Okay. So, this is obviously something that's facing a challenge at the highest levels. And Biden has said that he intends to honor the ACA and even expand it. But if the Supreme Court should rule against it, where do we go from there? I mean, a lot of people's health benefits are on the line. So what does Biden look to do to replace the ACA if it's ruled unconstitutional?
Well, you're right. The argument is Wednesday, November 10th. For those that are probably listening to this after the argument has occurred, and the decision would probably come out in the May-June timeframe. If the individual mandate is not severed from the rest of the statute, so the entire statute might fall, but for that severance of that particular provision, it's going to take all the oxygen out of the room. To be more specific, the individual mandate is the tax. Now the tax has gone away, and so the argument is, since you don't have a tax, since that was the basis of the decision that upheld the ACA, can you sever that provision out from the rest of the provisions of the statute and still have the rest of the statute in place, or does the entire statute fall? I mean, that's it in a nutshell. And if the entire statute's fall, you're absolutely correct. There's cataclysmic consequences. Let's assume we're sitting around, 6-7 months from now on June 15th, saying, boy, it looks like we finally got that virus under control. I've had my, second shot, and what the hell, I went in for 2 more. I liked them so much. So this is really good. We're finally come out of it. In Cowabunga, the Supreme Court says no ACA. That will take all of the oxygen out of the room. And all legislative activity will focus on what's the replacement. The question that I have, but which I haven't seen any commentary on, and maybe I just missed it, which is quite possible. Does President Biden anticipate that that might happen and try to engage in legislative activity that in essence makes the Supreme Court case moot before it gets decided upon? If it were me, that's what I would try to do, to demonstrate that degree of proactivity, and to take that off the table. But if I wanted to do that, and at the same time I'm dealing with the virus, with whatever legislation might come from that, such as an extension of CARES and some of the other things that we've talked about, I'm not sure how much else he could accomplish through legislation. The regulatory agencies, they just go do their thing. So I think, and I'm kind of surprised that I haven't heard that discussed, because if it were me, if I were president, which I'm not and never will be, there's one thing I know for certain. I certainly wouldn't put the future of healthcare in the country on a decision from the Supreme Court.
All right, so there's a lot of ambitious goals around minimum wage and overtime pay. And in terms of getting workers paid more, where does this president begin, and how much chance does he actually have of passing anything, given the state of the Senate and the type of opposition those efforts are going to get from corporations?
Well, there could certainly be regulatory activity coming out of the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor on the minimum wage, on the overtime provision. There was a lot of discussion about this during the Obama years. They came out with a rule. There was a lawsuit which we handled, negated. Was it 47,000 number or something like that? And then a new rule came out of this Department of Labor at a lower level, with the new Department of Labor, say that it's time to take another look. Is it time to, refresh that? I mean, it's pretty close in time. And again, we haven't had a very robust economy, but certainly, anything is possible with respect to the overtime. Absent some sort of a legislative enactment, I don't see any other way of dealing with the overtime rule. I think if you're going to go legislatively, and you're going to do the $15, and you're going to throw in some sick leave, and you're going to make overtime eligibility at a higher level because now it's 15 as opposed to 725. And while you're at it, why don't you throw in some predictive scheduling? That's a really, really big lift. And you're talking about a lot of sacred cows. And that will drive, people out of their rooms and saying, wait a minute, what about the tip wage? What about the this? What about the that? How can we have the same minimum wage for New York City that you have in Tuscaloosa? All of the familiar arguments with, my economists say it creates jobs. Your economists say it destroys jobs. I mean, it's not like we haven't seen this movie before. I think that what you're more likely to get on the minimum wage and the overtime deal is state activity. So as you know, Florida had a ballot initiative, and they've gone to 15. I think it's in 2026. I'm not 100% sure on that. But it's a gradual increase getting to 15 over a period of time. Florida gave you certainty. You know where you're going. You know where you're going to be. There are certain states, Washington State comes to mind. California is another, the country of California. They have, it's the country of fire and no light. We have all kinds of fire, and we have no light because PG&E turns off the light in order to prevent the fires. But the lawyers know how to work whether we have lightness or darkness. So they've created, all the jokes are free, by the way. They've created their own eligibility under state law, with respect to the overtime numbers. And California is, I forget, in the 40s, and Washington has just had a big increase. Pennsylvania is considering doing something like that, which may get challenged. So I think that it's more likely to see those kind of changes at the state. And when you look at the states, there are 17 states that are DDD trifectas. That means that the governor and the two chambers are all DDD. Like in California. And that creates an environment where you can potentially pass some very progressive, that's the right word, enactments. And I think that what you see companies doing, but very quietly, is they're making decisions about where to go, where to stay, and where to expand based upon that type of an environment. And I think that the smart states are seeing a competitive edge by saying, you don't have to worry about an ABC test here. Your minimum wage goes up, like in Florida, but it's going to go up gradually so that you're going to be able to plan for it. And maybe there's a general graduation based upon that as to what the overtime rules are. But you'll have certainty, you'll be able to plan. We, in our state, all of the cities cannot just pass whatever they want. So you'll have one set of labor and employment laws statewide, wherever you may happen to be. I think in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's like 20 or 30 different minimum wages. Up in Marin County, a little city called Novato has their own minimum wage. The question is, why? I mean, hello, is anybody home here? It's really like silly. So you're a cable installer and you spend 2 hours in Novato and 2 hours in San Rafael on the same day and you get two different wages. Why? It's more difficult to lay cable in Novato than it is in San Rafael? I don't think so. So if you provide companies with that degree of certainty, even if it means that it may be a little bit higher, companies can adapt to that. And that kind of state preemption of what cities do is becoming more and more and more important and very appealing if you're a business trying to figure out where you're going to go.
And it's interesting. I live in Florida, and it's rare that we get so much right in an election. We got the count right? And we got the, I think we did the minimum wage thing right.
Yeah. I think you probably did, and I'm glad that you weren't the butt of any jokes or the butt of any jokes this time.
Yeah, for once, you know.
Yeah, you had enough for a lifetime, so you don't need any
we
more.
we really have. You know, it seems to me like a key bargaining chip for Biden could be around infrastructure progress, something that President Trump had promised, but he kind of failed to deliver on during his tenure. So I'm wondering, is that something that you think he can use to reach across the aisle with and get himself a bit of a win as he gets a lot of, you know, gets a lot of folks in construction related business, a steady diet of work. Is that something that he can kind of build on?
On President Trump's time in office, that was a real missed opportunity. I think that, you know, infrastructure is a way of really getting everybody around the table and coming up with some compromise. You know, you're giving, first of all, we need infrastructure improvements desperately, whether it's airports, roads, schools, so on and so forth. It's not like bridges. It's not like we don't have a whole long list of things to do. You know, it reminds me a little bit of, you know, FDR, you know, when he put everybody to work. And, you know, this may be a situation, you know, where we got to put everybody to work. And then what are the terms of that work? How do they work safely? How do they work without discrimination? How do they work in an environment that may be very respectful of union rights? You know, are they going to work under project labor agreements? What are those rates going to be? Does that make sense now, given the pandemic and the fact that the economy is not where it should be? A lot of issues to discuss, a lot of bargaining chips there. And it's a way of getting people to the table. You know, I'm having a tough time with a legislator from Miami. And, you know, I'm able to say, hey, you want that bridge rebuilt? You know, it's amazing how people's minds can get changed, you know, under those circumstances. So there's a lot of chips that go with that. And I think that was really incredible lost opportunity for President Trump. And, you know, the building trades, to a great extent, still supported him. But he could have really gotten organized labor, a great segment of organized labor to have supported him. And I think that's another inducement that you get by supporting that type of a thing. So, yeah, I think infrastructure could be a big deal.
Okay. So there's also, you know, we mentioned the impact of COVID on everything, and you know, it's impacted people and business. So what does this administration look to do out of the gate to kind of help keep people afloat, help businesses weather the storm, especially since we're in the midst of a second wave here, and more lockdown restrictions may be necessary?
Um, well, I think that, you know, as the president-elect has said, you got to follow the science, and clearly, you know, you do, and that's way beyond my capabilities. But some things, you know, from a labor and employment perspective, you're clearly going to see a lot more activity from OSHA in a Biden administration, and you know, you may even get, you know, a directive for an emergency temporary standard as part of any sort of a COVID relief proposal. So a lot more activity out of OSHA, a lot more guidance, a lot more direction as to what to do, how to do it. So I think that's one thing to expect. Another issue is what we've talked about. You know, do you extend the CARES Act? You know, do you provide more unemployment? Do you extend the 27 weeks to July 1? I'm just, you know, picking a date. And, you know, it may be that, you know, if the vaccine, let's hope, let's pray, is successful, maybe we get out of this a little bit sooner than we thought. You know, maybe not. So maybe you only extend it until May 1 or something. You know, those things, you know, can be discussed. But I think with the sick leave, as well as with the unemployment, that becomes very, very important. And I think you also touched upon infrastructure. That's something that can be done too in order to help us and get the economy to thrive. I also hope that we come together. And if I were president of the United States, I would go to somebody and I would have them make a gazillion masks. And on the mask, they were red, white, and blue with USA on them. And I would ask everybody in the country to wear that mask. And after all, I hope we all think that we're still Americans. Without any kind of a political overtone to it, why are we doing this? We're doing this as a country to come together in a unified theme, in a recognition. Get this from my science days. If I get close to you and some of the droplets from my speaking, gets inside you, maybe that's not good for you. Now, do you have to be a flipping genius to figure that out?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that hard, right?
Yeah.
Even I know that. So if we could do something to bring people together like that, maybe people would react negatively because it's USA. I don't, but we have to have a unifying theme. I said to a lady the other day, a stranger, who I was talking to in a store. I had a big day. I went to a store. And I said, can you imagine what it was like for our ancestors in World War II? What was it like on the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed? What was it like when FDR said that this is a day of infamy and we're going to war? What was it like when all means of production were to the war? What was it like to see how many of your loved ones go off to fight? But yet the country came together with such a wonderful celebration after so much horror at the end of that. Why can't we do that here?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, call it, collectivist thinking or whatever you want, just working towards the collective good. I mean, we need a little bit of it right now, for sure.
Yeah, I'd have on my staff of advisors some real hotshot sociologists and psychologists, I'll tell you. And good communication people, because you do know we're a land of messaging and not a land of fact. So the way you talk about these things is in many ways, unfortunately, more important than what the facts are behind them.
Yeah, it's all in the delivery, not in the content, unfortunately.
It's all in the delivery. And remember the old days when content was king? Well, the heck with that.
You had mentioned some of the kind of equal opportunity stuff earlier, in the workplace. And I'm wondering, what are some of the goals this administration can achieve? It's likely that Biden will switch the chair, put a Democratic majority back on the Equal Opportunity Commission. So what will then be their goals? What are they going to look to kind of undo certain policies from the Trump era, stuff like that?
Well, I mentioned the first one is this diversity training directive that came out 6-8 weeks ago. That will be negated right away. That's created a lot of angst for many government contractors that are questioning the diversity training that they undertake. Some of which was modified in order to reflect what happened, with respect to Black Lives Matters, the horror with respect to Mr. Floyd, and all of those kinds of things, which raised even further the national conscience on those kinds of race-related issues. So I think that, some people said, what kind of a curveball is this? So I think Mr. Biden will throw us a fastball and say, hey, keep doing what you're doing, only do more of it. That's more of an OFCCP thing out of the Department of Labor as opposed to the EEOC, but they still relate. I think on the EEOC side, you're right. I mean, he will select quickly one of the Democratic members to be the chair. And the chair of the EEOC has a great deal of responsibility. They could still be outvoted 3-2, but they have a lot of power to direct. unlike, for example, the chair of the NLRB, which is really the first among equals, but has a lot of administrative responsibilities. Chair of the EOC is a little bit different. So what direction do they take on wellness? What direction do they take on some of the other issues with respect to harassment, the pay issue? We had all kinds of problems with the expansion of the EEO-1 and the pay data and the lawsuits. This current EEOC shutting that down. What do they do about that? We've just seen new guidance with respect to mediation and reconciliation to resolve things quicker. What direction goes out to the EEOC investigators? What direction goes from the general counsel of the EEOC? So I think you'll see more enforcement, and we really need some help on these wellness regulations. And it's constantly evolving with respect to some of the discrimination issues. They're going to have to deal with the religious issues because after Bostock, there's going to be, there continues to be a lot of open questions, and some of them are going to the Supreme Court too, especially on the issue of the sexual orientation and the religious issues. So I think we're going to see the need for some clarification as that law continues to evolve.
All right. So just one final question, and we talk a lot about in HR, particularly, and about the future of work. Especially as work displacement continues to automation, and I think I saw a stat recently. 85 million jobs may be displaced by technology during this crisis. So what are you looking to see from this administration when we talk about the future of work?
Well, to me, the future of work and workplace displacement is a critical strategic issue. And I've been talking about it for 3 years. I actually have a separate 501c3, the Emma Coalition, nonprofit that deals with this issue. And Emma doesn't have any fancy names after what's it mean and whatever. Emma is my granddaughter. And we've always, as an adult, asked a child, what do you want to be when you grow up? And Emma's correct answer to me should be, Papa, I have no idea because my job hasn't been created yet. So we had displacement going on, which we call TIDE, technologically induced displacement of employees, which has now been accelerated by VIDE, virus-induced displacement of employees. So TIDE and VIDE coming together are creating this tremendous workplace transformation. Are you ever going to work from an office again? How long can people work outside of that office? If you used to be in San Francisco, and since you could work wherever you wanted to, and you decided to go to Boise, does the Boise tax rate apply to you? And does the Boise sick leave rules apply to you? Or does the San Francisco sick leave rule apply to you? If you get laid off, does the Idaho UI rules apply to you? Or the California rules apply to you? There's all of those issues that are going on. They're technical, but they're awfully, awfully important. What do we do with respect to the robots, the cobot situation? You see that more and more in manufacturing. You certainly see that in distribution. There's safety issues that come about. There's also who fixes the robot. The robot, they expand the total number of people if you're an expanding operation. But if you're not an expanding operation and you're doing this in order to maintain profitability, you're going to reduce the total number of employees, but some of those jobs are going to change because maybe you're not just the widget maker, but maybe you're now the robot fixer. And maybe the widget maker made $15 an hour, and maybe the robot fixer makes $30 an hour. So the question becomes, how do you gain those skills? And people talk about $15 an hour. I'd prefer to talk about lifelong learning accounts. Because if there's one thing that we know is this workplace is going to constantly change as a result of AI, robotics, and other circumstances that we couldn't predict, like the pandemic. I would expect that this administration, and frankly, it's in my experience been easier to talk to Democrats about this issue than Republicans. We need the equivalent of a GI Bill. We need a national workplace plan. Germany's got one, China's got one, other countries have them. This is important from a competitive position. It's also a national security issue. And given the tremendous displacement that's taking place now, with the recognition that many of those people that have unfortunately lost their jobs, it's hard to think back in February, we were at the peak of all peaks with respect to employment. And now we're back to where we were in the 30s. Yeah, it's getting better, but we still got a long, long way to go to get back to where we were. Where are those people going to go? What jobs are they going to get? There's not going to be as many quote unquote entry-level positions to flip hamburgers, because Flippy the robot's going to flip your hamburger. But there's going to be somebody who's going to have to fix Flippy, because if he puts out every hamburger without ketchup on it, people are going to be annoyed. So who fixes the ketchup button? Somebody's got to do it, and somebody's going to be probably on site to do it. So we need a skill assessment. What skills are going to go away? What skills are going to be needed? Then we need a nationwide workplace investment plan. We already have a statute, WIOA, Workplace Innovation Act, where billions of dollars every year go out to the states in order to provide workplace training. That's a great potential vehicle to put some structure as to what the expectation is, to turn to individuals, to get them to undertake this type of analysis of skills going away, skills that are going to be needed. The state of Washington did their analysis. California's done their analysis. But a lot of that has barely been slowed down as a result of the pandemic, because there's all of these other crises. But on the other side, the pandemic has just made it even more obvious. So workplace transformation from an HR perspective is, for me, the number one issue. And I've been, around HR people my whole career. I was the chair of SHRM back in, 2000, and talked about these issues all the time. The HR people always want to have a seat at the table. And as far as I'm concerned, workplace transformation defines the table. This is where HR can step up. This is where HR can say, we have a company issue, we have a city issue, we have a county issue, we have a state issue, we have a national issue, and we need to engage. And that's, for example, what Emma does from a policy perspective.
Very interesting stuff, Michael. I really appreciate you coming on today. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. So listeners, if you're wanting to dig into this stuff a little bit deeper, Littler has put out a report through their Workplace Policy Institute. Just go on littler.com, look for WPI report election 2020, and you can download it there. So Michael, again, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, it's been a pleasure. I hope we can do it someday when we have a little bit more certainty and we get this virus behind us. So to you and to all of your listeners, be safe out there.